We all back? Alright, cool, because I'm very excited to conclude this. Isaac Hasselhoff, little gem of a book with you guys in his The Naked Sun. I think we left off earlier just today, chapter the 69th. Oh, no. Chapter the 15th? Where were we? Yes, we did the 15th. Maybe... Yes. Maybe this will suit our needs better. Chapter the 16th. A solution is offered. Baley was aware, first of enclosure, the absence of the open, and then a face bending over him. He stared for a moment without recognition, then, "Daniel!" The robot's face showed no sign of relief, or of any other recognizable emotion at being addressed. It said, "It is well that you have recovered consciousness, partner Elijah. I do not believe you have suffered physical injury." "I'm all right," said Baley, testily, struggling to his elbows. "Jehoshaphat, am I in bed?" "What for?" "You have been exposed to the open a number of times today. The effects upon you have been cumulative, and you need rest." "I need to get answers first." Baley looked about and tried to deny to himself that his head was spinning just a little. He did not recognize the room. The curtains were drawn. Light was comfortably artificial. He was feeling much better. "For instance, where am I?" "In a room of Miss Delmar's mansion." "Next, let's get something straight. What are you doing here? How did you get away from the robots I set over you?" Daniel said, "It had seemed to me that you would be displeased at this development, and yet in the interests of your safety and of my orders, I felt that I had no choice but—" "What did you do? Jehoshaphat!" "It seemed Mrs. Delmar attempted to view you some hours ago." "Yes." Baley remembered Gladia saying as much earlier in the day. "I know that." "Your order to the robots that held me prisoner was, in your words, 'Do not allow him,' meaning myself, 'to establish contact with other humans or other robots, either by seeing or by viewing.' Partner Elijah, you said nothing about forbidding other humans or robots to contact me. You see the distinction?" Baley groaned. Daniel said, "No need for distress, partner Elijah. The flaw in your orders was instrumental in saving your life, since it brought me to the scene. You see, when Miss Delmar feared me, being allowed to do so by my robot guardians, she asked after you, and I answered quite truthfully that I did not know of your whereabouts, but that I could attempt to find out. She seemed anxious that I do so. I said I thought it possible you might have left the house temporarily, and that I would check that matter, and would she, in the meanwhile, order the robots of the room with me to search the mansion for your presence." "Wasn't she surprised that you didn't deliver the orders to the robots yourself?" "I gave her the impression, I believe, that as an Auroran I was not accustomed to robots as she was, that she might deliver the orders with greater authority and effect a more speedy consummation. Solarians, it is quite clear, are vain in their skill with robots and contemptuous of the ability of natives of other planets to handle them. Is that not your opinion as well, partner Elijah?" "And she ordered them away, then?" "With difficulty. They protested previous orders, but, of course, could not state the nature thereof, since you had ordered them to tell no one of my true identity. She overrode them, although the final order had to be shrilled out in a fury." "In a fury?" "Shrilled out in a fury." "And then you left." "I did, partner Elijah." A pity, thought Baley, that Gladdy did not consider that episode important enough to relate to him when he viewed her. He said, "It took you long enough to find me, Daniel." "The robots on Solaria have a network of information through sub-etheric contact. A skilled Solarian could obtain information readily, But mediated as it is through millions of individual machines, one such as myself, without experience in the matter, must take time to unearth a single datum. It was better than an hour before the information as to your whereabouts reached me. I lost further time by visiting Dr. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 place of business after you had departed. What were you doing there? Pursuing researches of my own. I regret that this had to be done in your absence, but the exigencies of the investigation left me no choice. Baley said, Did you view Clarissa Cantoro? Or see her? I viewed her, but from another part of the building, not from our own estate. There were records at the farm I had to see. Ordinarily, viewing would have been sufficient, but it might have been inconvenient to remain in our own estate, since 3 robots knew my real nature, and might easily have imprisoned me once more. Baley felt almost well. He swung his legs out of bed and found himself in a kind of nightgown. He stared at it with distaste. Get me my clothes. Tennille did so. As Baley dressed, he said, Where's Mrs. 𝗧𝗵𝗲? Under house arrest, partner Elijah. What? By whose order? By my order. She is confined to her bedroom under robotic guard, and her right to give orders other than to meet personal needs has been neutralized. By yourself. The robots of the state are not aware of my identity. Baley finished dressing. I knew the case against 𝗧𝗵𝗲, he said. She had the opportunity. More of it, in fact, than we thought at first. She did not rush to the scene of the sound of her husband's cry, as she first said. She was there all along. Does she claim to have witnessed the murder and seen the murderer? No. She remembers nothing of the crucial moments. That happened sometimes. It turned out, also, that she has a motive. What was it, partner Elijah? One that I had suspected as a possibility from the first. I said to myself, if this were Earth, and Dr. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 were, as she has described, to be, and 𝗧𝗵𝗲 𝗧𝗵𝗲, as she seems to be, I would say that she was in love with him, or had been, and that he was in love only with himself. The difficulty was to tell whether Solarians felt love or reacted to love in any earthly sense. My judgment as to their emotions and reactions wasn't to be trusted. It was why I had to see a few, not view them, but see them. I do not follow you, partner Elijah. I don't know if I can explain it to you. These people have their gene possibilities carefully plotted before birth, and the actual gene distribution tested after birth. I know that. But genes aren't everything. Environment counts too. An environment can bend into actual psychosis, where genes indicate only a potential for a particular psychosis. Did you notice 𝗧𝗵𝗲's interest in Earth? I remarked upon it, partner Elijah. I considered it an assumed interest designed to influence your opinions. Suppose it were a real interest, even a fascination. Suppose there was something about Earth's crowds that excited her. Suppose she were attracted against her will by something she had been taught to consider filthy. There was possible abnormality. I had to test it by seeing Solarians and notice how they reacted to it, and seeing her and noticing how she reacted to it. It was why I had to get away from you, Daniel, at any cost. It is why I had to abandon viewing as a method for carrying on the investigation. You did not explain this, partner Elijah. Would the explanation have helped against what you conceive your duty under the first law to be? Tennille was silent. Baley said, The experiment worked. I saw, or tried to see, several people. An old sociologist tried to see me and had to give up midway. The roboticist refused to see me at all, even under terrific force. The bare possibility sent him into an almost infantile frenzy. He sucked his finger and wept. Dr. 𝗧𝗵𝗲's assistant was used to personal presence in the way of her profession, so she tolerated me, but at 20 feet only. 𝗧𝗵𝗲, on the other hand. Yes, partner Elijah. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 consented to see me without more than a slight hesitation. She tolerated my presence easily and actually showed signs of decreasing strain as time went on. It all fits into a pattern of psychosis. She didn't mind seeing me. She was interested in Earth. She might have felt an abnormal interest in her husband. All of it could be explained by a strong and, for this world, psychotic interest in the personal presence of members of the opposite sex. Dr. 𝗏𝗲 himself was not the type to encourage such a feeling or cooperate with it. It must have been very frustrating for her. Daniil nodded. Frustration enough for murder in a moment of passion. In spite of everything, I don't think so, Daniil. Are you perhaps being influenced by extraneous motives on your own partner, Elijah? Mrs. 𝗏𝗲 is an attractive woman, and you are an earthman in whom the preference for the personal presence of an attractive woman is not psychotic. I have better reasons, said Baley uneasily. Daniil's cool glance was too penetrating and soul-dissecting by half. 𝗧𝗵𝗲, the thing was only a machine. He said, if she were the murderess of her husband, she would also have to be the attempted murderess of Gruer. He had almost an impulse to explain the way murder could be manipulated through robots, but held back. He was not sure how Daniil would react to the theory that made unwitting murderers of robots. Daniil said, and the attempted murderess of yourself as well. Baley frowned. He had had no intention of telling Daniil of the poisoned arrow that had missed, no intention of strengthening the other's already too strong protective complex vis-a-vis himself. He said angrily, What did Clarissa tell you? He ought to have warned her to keep quiet, but then, how was he to know that Daniil would be about asking questions? Daniil said calmly, Mrs. 𝗏𝗏 had nothing to do with the matter. I witnessed the murder attempt myself. And Baley was thoroughly confused. You would know whereabout? Daniil said, I caught you myself and brought you here an hour ago. What are you talking about? Do you not remember, partner Elijah? It was almost a perfect murder. Did not Mrs. 𝗏𝗲 suggest that you go out into the open? I was not a witness to this, but I feel certain she did. She did suggest it, yes. She may even have enticed you to leave the house. Baley thought of the portrait of himself, of the enclosing grey walls. Could it have been clever psychology? Could a Solarian have that much intuitive understanding of the psychology of an earthman? No, he said. Daniil said, Was it she who suggested you go down to the ornamental pond and sit on the bench? Well, yes. Does it occur to you that she might have been watching you, noticing your gathering dizziness? She asked me once or twice if I wanted to go back. She might not have meant it seriously. She might have been watching you turn sicker on the bench. She might even have pushed you, or perhaps a push wasn't necessary. At the moment I reached you and caught you in my arms, you were in the process of falling backwards off the stone bench and into 3 feet of water, in which you would surely have drowned. For the first time, Baley recalled those last fugitive sensations. 𝗧𝗵𝗲. Moreover, said Daniil with calm relentlessness, Miss 𝗏𝗲 sat beside you, watching you fall, without a move to stop you. Nor would she have attempted to pull you out of the water. She would have let you drown. She might have called a robot, but the robot would surely have arrived too late. And afterward, she would explain merely that, of course, it was impossible for her to touch you, even to save your life. True enough, thought Baley. No one would question her inability to touch a human being. The surprise, if any, would come at her ability to be so close to one as she was. Daniil said, You see, then, partner Elijah, that her guilt can scarcely be in question. You stated that she would have to be the attempted murderess of Agent Gruer, as though this were an argument against her guilt. You see now that she must have been. Her only motive to murder you was the same as her motive for trying to murder Gruer, the necessity of getting rid of an embarrassingly persistent investigator of the first murder. Baley said the whole sequence might be an innocent one. She might never have realized how the outdoors would affect me. She studied Earth. She knew the peculiarities of Earthmen. I assured her I had been outdoors today and that I was growing used to it. She may have known better. Baley pounded his fist against palm. You're making her too clever. It doesn't fit, and I don't believe it. In any case, no murder accusation can stick, and until the absence of the murder weapon can be accounted for. Daniel looked steadily at the Earthman. I can do that too, partner Elijah. Baley looked at his robotic partner with a stunned expression. How? Your reasoning, you will remember, partner Elijah, was this. Were Mrs. 𝗓𝗲𝗓 the murderess, then the weapon, whatever it was, must have remained at the scene of the murder. The robots, appearing almost at once, saw no sign of such a weapon, hence it must have been removed from the scene. Hence the murderer must have removed it. Hence the murderer could not be Mrs. 𝗓𝗲𝗓. Is all that correct? Correct. Yet, continued the robot, there is one place where the robots did not look for the weapon. Where? Under Miss 𝗓𝗲𝗓. She was lying in a faint, brought on by the excitement and passion of the moment, whether murderers or not, and the weapon, whatever it were, lay under her and out her sight. Baley said, Then the weapon would have to be discovered as soon as she was moved. Exactly, said Daniel, but she was not moved by the robots. She herself told us yesterday at dinner that Dr. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 ordered the robots to put a pillow under her head and leave her. She was first moved by Dr. 𝗓𝗵𝗲 himself when he arrived to examine her. So, it follows, therefore, partner Elijah, that a new possibility arises. Mrs. 𝗓𝗲𝗓 was the murderess. The weapon was at the scene of the crime, but Dr. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 carried it off and disposed of it to protect Mrs. 𝗓𝗲𝗓. Baley felt contemptuous. He had almost been seduced into expecting something reasonable. He said, Completely motiveless. Why should Dr. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 do such a thing? For a very good reason. You remember Mrs. 𝗓𝗲𝗓's remarked concerning him. He always treated me since I was a child, and was always so friendly and kind. I wonder if he might have some motive for being particularly concerned for her. It was for that reason that I visited the baby farm and inspected the records. What I had merely guessed at as a possibility turned out to be the truth. What? Dr. 𝗓𝗵𝗲 was the father of Gladia 𝗓𝗲𝗓, and what is more, he knew of the relationship. Baley had not thought of disbelieving the robot. He felt only a deep chagrin that it had been the robot Daniel 𝗓𝗓𝗓 and not himself that had carried through the necessary pieces of logical analysis, even so it was not complete. He said, Have you spoken to Dr. 𝗧𝗵𝗲? Yes, I have placed him under house arrest also. What does he say? He admits that he is the father of Mrs. 𝗓𝗲𝗓. I confronted him with the records of the fact of the records and of the inquiries into her health when she was a youngster. As a doctor, he was allowed more leeway in this respect than any other Solarian might have been allowed. Why should he have inquired into her health? I have considered that too, partner Elijah. He was an old man when he was given special permission to have an additional child, and, what is more, he succeeded in producing one. He considered this a tribute to his genes and to his physical fitness. He is prouder of the result, perhaps, than is quite customary on this world. Moreover, his position as physician, a profession little regarded on Solaria because it involved personal presence, made it the more important for him to nurture the sense of pride. For that reason, he maintained obtrusive contact with his offspring. Does Gladia know anything of it? As far as Dr. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 is aware, partner Elijah, she does not. Baley said, Does 𝗧𝗵𝗲 admit removing the weapon? No, that he does not. Then you've got nothing, Daniel. Nothing. Unless you can find the weapon and prove he took it, or at the very least induce him to confess, you have no evidence. A chain of deduction is pretty, but it isn't evidence. A man would scarcely confess without considerable questioning of a type I myself cannot carry through. His daughter is dear to him. Not at all, said Baley. His feelings for his daughter is not at all what you and I are accustomed to. Solaria is different. He strolled the length of the room and back, letting himself cool. He said, Daniel, You have worked out a perfect exercise in logic, but none of it is reasonable, just the same. Logic, but not reasonable. Wasn't that the definition of a robot? They went on. Dr. Thule is an old man, and past his best years, regardless of whether he was capable of siring a daughter 30 years or so ago. Even spacers get senile. Picture him then examining the daughter in a faint, and his son-in-law dead by violence. Can you imagine the unusual nature of the situation for him? Can you suppose he could have remained master of himself, so much the master of himself, in fact, as to carry out a series of amazing actions? Look, first he would have to notice a weapon under his daughter, one that was so well covered by her body that the robots had never noticed it. Secondly, from whatever small scrap of object he noted, he must have deduced the presence of the weapon, and seen at once that if he could but sneak off with that weapon unseen, a murder accusation against his daughter would be hard to substantiate. That's pretty subtle thinking for an old man in a panic. Then, thirdly, he would have to carry the plan through. Also tough for an old man in a panic. And now, lastly, he would have to dare to compound the felony further by sticking to his lie. It all may be the result of logical thinking, but none of it is reasonable. Daniel said, "Do you have an alternative solution to the crime, partner Elijah?" Baley had sat down during the course of his last speech, and now he tried to rise again, but a combination of weariness and the depth of the chair defeated him. He held out his hand petulantly. "Give me a hand, will you, Daniel?" Daniel stared at his own hand. "I beg your pardon, partner Elijah." Baley silently swore at the other's literal mind and said, "Help me out of this chair." Daniel's strong arm lifted him out of the chair effortlessly. Baley said, "Thanks." "No, I haven't an alternative solution. At least I have, but the whole thing hinges on the location of the weapon." He walked impatiently to the heavy curtains that lined most of one wall and lifted a corner without quite realizing what he was doing. He stared at the black patch of glass until he became aware of the fact that he was looking out into the early night, and then dropped the curtain just as Daniel, approaching quietly, took it from his fingers. In the split fraction of a moment in which Baley watched the robot's hand take the curtain away from him with a loving caution of a mother protecting her child from a fire, a revolution took place inside him. He snatched the curtain back, yanked it out of Daniel's grasp. Throwing his full weight against it, he tore it away from the window, leaving shreds behind. "Partner Elijah," said Daniel softly, "surely you know what the open will do to you." "I know," said Baley, "what it will do for me." He stared out the window. There was nothing to see, only blackness, but that blackness was open air. It was unbroken, unobstructed space, even if unlit, and he was facing it. And for the first time, he faced it freely. It was no longer bravado, or perverse curiosity, or the pathway to a solution of a murder. He faced it because he knew he wanted to, and because he needed to. That made all the difference. Walls were crutches. Darkness and crowds were crutches. He must have thought them so, unconsciously, and hated them even when he most thought he loved and needed them. Why else had he so resented Gladia's gray enclosure of the portrait? He felt himself filling with a sense of victory, and as though victory were contagious, a new thought came, bursting like an inner shout. Baley turned dizzily to Daniel. "I know," he whispered. "Jehoshaphat, I know." "Know what, partner Elijah?" "I know what happened to the weapon. I know who is responsible. All at once, everything falls into place." Chapter the 16th, +1. A meeting is held. Pardon me. Earl Grey. Cheers. As we were, Daniel would allow no immediate action. "Tomorrow," he had said with respectful firmness. "That is my suggestion, partner Elijah. It is late for you, and you are in need of rest." Baley had to admit the truth of it. And, besides, there was the need of preparation, a considerable quantity of it. He had the solution of the murder, he felt sure of that, but it rested on deduction. As much as had Daniel's theory, and it was worth as little as evidence. Solarians would have to help him. And if he were to face them, one Earthman against half a dozen spacers, he would have to be in full control. That meant rest and preparation. Yet he would not sleep. He was certain he would not sleep. Not all the softness of the special bed set up for him by smoothly functioning robots, nor all the soft perfume and softer music in the special room of 𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧's mansion would help. He was sure of it. Daniil sat unobtrusively in one darkened corner. Baley said, "Are you still afraid of 𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧?" The robot said, "I do not think it wise to allow you to sleep alone and unprotected." "Well, have your way." "Are you clear as to what I want you to do, Daniil?" "I am, partner Elijah." "You have no reservations under the first law, I hope?" "I have some with respect to the conference you wish to arrange." "You will be armed and careful of your own safety?" "I assure you I will." Daniil delivered himself a sigh that was somehow so human that for a moment Baley found himself trying to penetrate the darkness that he might study the machine-perfect face of the other. Daniil said, "I have not always found human behavior logical." "We need 3 laws of our own," said Baley, "but I'm glad we don't have them." He stared at the ceiling. A great deal depended on Daniil, and yet he could tell him very little of the whole truth. Robots were too involved. The planet, Aurora, had its reasons for sending a robot as a representative of their interest, but it was a mistake. The robots had their limitations. Still, if all went right, this could be over in 12 hours. He could be heading back to Earth in 24, bearing hope. A strange kind of hope, a kind he could scarcely believe himself, but it was Earth's way out. It must be Earth's way out. Earth. New York, Jesse and Ben, the comfort and familiarity and dearness of home. He dwelt on it, half asleep, and the thought of Earth failed to conjure the comfort he expected. There was an estrangement between himself and the cities, and at some unknown point in time it all faded and he slept. Baley, having slept and then wakened, showered and dressed. Physically he was quite prepared, yet he was unsure. It was not that his reasoning seemed any less cogent to himself in the pallor of morning, it was rather the necessity of facing the Solarians. Could he be sure of their reactions after all? Or would he still be working blind? 𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧 was the first to appear. It was simple for her, of course. She was in the intramural circuit, since she was in the mansion herself. She was pale and expressionless, in a white gown that draped her into a cold statue. She stared helplessly at Baley. Baley smiled back gently, and she seemed to take comfort from that. One by one, they appeared now. 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, the acting head of security, appeared next to 𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗏, lean and haughty, his large chin set in disapproval. Then 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, the roboticist, impatient and angry, his weak eyelid fluttering periodically. 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, the sociologist, a little tired but smiling at Baley out of a deep-set eyes in a condescending way, as though to say, "We have seen one another. We have been intimate." Clarissa Contaro, when she appeared, seemed uneasy in the presence of the others. She glanced at 𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗏 for a moment, with an audible sniff, then stared at the floor. Dr. 𝗧𝗏, the physician, appeared last. He looked haggard, almost sick. They were all there, all but Gruer, who was slowly recovering, and for whom attendance was physically impossible. Well, thought Baley, will do without him. All were dressed formally. All sat in rooms that were well curtained into enclosure. Daniil had arranged matters well. Baley hoped fervently that what remained for Daniil to do would work as well. Baley looked from one spacer to the other. His heart thudded. Each figure viewed him out of a different room, and the clash of lighting, furniture, and wall decoration was dizzying. Baley said, "I want to discuss the matter of the killing of Dr. 𝗧𝗏𝗏𝗏 𝗏𝗏𝗏 under the heading of motive, opportunity, and means, in that order. Ethelbish interrupted. Will this be a long speech? Baley said sharply. It may be. I have been called here to investigate a murder, and such a job is my speciality and my profession. I know best how to go about it. Taking nothing from them now, he thought, this whole thing won't work. Dominate? Dominate. He went on, making his words as sharp and incisive as he could. Motive first. In a way, motive is the most unsatisfactory of the three items. Opportunity and means are objective. They can be investigated factually. Motive is subjective. It may be something we can observe by others, revenge for a known humiliation, for instance, but it may also be completely unobservable as irrational, homicidal hate on the part of a well-disciplined person who never lets it show. Now, almost all of you have told me at one time or another that you believe Gladia 𝗏𝗲 to have committed the crime. Certainly, no one has suggested an alternative suspect. Has Gladia a motive? Dr. Liebig suggested one. He said that Gladia quarreled frequently with her husband, and Gladia later admitted this to me. The rage that can arise out of a quarrel can conceivably move a person to murder. Very well. The question remains, though, whether she is the only one with a motive. I wonder. Dr. Liebig himself, the roboticist, almost jumped, his hand extended rigidly in the direction of Baley. Watch what you say, Earthman. I am only theorizing, Baley said coldly. You, Dr. Liebig, were working with Dr. 𝗏𝗲 on a new robot model. You are the best man in Solaria as far as robotics is concerned. You say so, and I believe you. Liebig smiled with open condescension. Baley went on. But I have heard that Dr. 𝗏𝗲 was about to break off relations with you for matters concerning yourself of which he disapproved. False? False! Perhaps, but what if it were true? Wouldn't you have a motive to get rid of him before he humiliated you publicly by breaking with you? I have a feeling you could not easily bear such humiliation. Baley went on rapidly, to give Liebig no chance to retort. And you, Mrs. Contoro, Dr. 𝗏𝗲's death leaves you in charge of fetal engineering, a responsible position. Skies above. We talked about that before, cried Clarissa in anguish. I know we did, but it's a point that must be considered anyway. As for Dr. 𝗏𝗲, he plays chess with Dr. 𝗏𝗲 regularly. Perhaps he grew annoyed at losing too many times. The sociologist interposed quietly. Losing a game of chess is insufficient motive, surely, plainclothesman. It depends on how seriously you take your chess. Motives can seem all the world to the murderer who completely insignificant to everyone else. Well, it doesn't matter. My point is that the motive alone is insufficient. Anyone can have a motive, particularly for the murder of a man such as Dr. 𝗏𝗲. What do you mean by that remark? Demanded 𝗏𝗏 in indignation. Why, only that Dr. 𝗏𝗲 was a good Solarian. You all describe him as such. He rigidly fulfilled all the requirements of Solarian custom. He was an ideal man, almost an abstraction. He could feel love, or even liking. Who could feel love, or even liking, for such a man? A man without weakness serves only to make everyone else conscious of his own imperfections. A primitive poet named Tennyson once wrote, "He is all fault who has no fault at all." No one would kill a man for being too good, said Clarissa, frowning. You know little. I'm sorry, you little know, said Baley. He went on without amplification. Dr. 𝗏𝗲 was aware of a conspiracy on Solaria, or thought he was, a conspiracy that was preparing an assault on the rest of the galaxy for purposes of conquest. He was interested in preventing that. For that reason, those concerned in the conspiracy might find it necessary to do away with him. Anyone here could be a member of the conspiracy, including, to be sure, Mrs. 𝗏𝗲, but including even the acting head of security, Corwin Ethelbish. Aye, said Ethelbish, unmoved. You certainly attempted to end the investigation as soon as Gruer's mishap put you in charge. Baley took a few slow sips of his drink, straight from its original container, untouched by human hands other than his own, or robotic hands either, and gathered his strength. So far, This was a waiting game, and he was thankful the Solarians were sitting still for it. They hadn't the earthman's experience of dealing with people at close quarters. They weren't in-fighters. He said, "Opportunity next." It is the general opinion that only Mrs. 𝗏𝗲 had the opportunity, since she could approach her husband in actual personal presence. Are we sure of that? Suppose someone other than Mrs. 𝗏𝗲 had made up his or her mind to kill Dr. 𝗏𝗲. Would not such a desperate resolution make the discomfort of personal presence secondary? If any of you were set on murder, wouldn't you bear personal presence just long enough to do the job? Couldn't you sneak into the 𝗏𝗲 mansion? Edelbush interposed frigidly. You are ignorant of the matter, Earthman. Whether we would or wouldn't doesn't matter. The fact is that Dr. 𝗏𝗲 himself would not allow seeing, I assure you. If anyone came into his personal presence, regardless of how valued and long-standing a friendship there was between them, Dr. 𝗏𝗲 would order him away and, if necessary, call the robots to help with the ejection. True, said Baley, if Dr. 𝗏𝗲 were aware that personal presence was involved. What do you mean by that? Demanded Dr. Thule in surprise, his voice quavering. When you treated Mrs. 𝗏𝗲 at the scene of the murder, replied Baley, looking full at his questioner, she assumed that you were viewing her until you actually touched her. So she told me, and so I believe. I am, myself, accustomed only to seeing. When I arrived on Solaria and met security head 𝗏𝗏r, I assumed I was seeing him. When, at the end of our interview, 𝗏𝗏r disappeared, I was taken completely by surprise. Now assume the reverse. Suppose that for all a man's adult life he had been viewing only, never seeing anyone, except on rare occasions with his wife. Now suppose someone other than his wife walked up to him in personal presence. Would he not automatically assume that it was a matter of viewing, particularly if a robot had been instructed to advise 𝗏𝗲 that viewing contact was being set up? Not for a minute, said 𝗏𝗏. The sameness of background would give it away. Maybe, but how many of you are aware of backgrounds now? There would be a minute or so, at least, before Dr. 𝗏𝗲 would grow aware that something was wrong, and at this time his friend, whoever he was, could walk up to him, raise his club, and bring it down. Impossible, said 𝗏𝗏 stubbornly. I think not, said Baley. I think opportunity must be cancelled out as absolute proof that Mrs. 𝗏𝗲 is the murderess. She had opportunity, but so might others. Baley waited again. He felt perspiration on his forehead, but wiping it away would make him look weak. He must maintain absolute charge of the proceedings. The person at whom he was aiming must be placed in self-convincing inferiority. It was hard for an Earthman to do that to a spacer. Baley looked from face to face and decided that matters were at least progressing satisfactorily. Even Adelbush looked quite humanly concerned. And so we come, he said, to means, and that is the most puzzling factor of all. The weapon with which the murder was committed was never found. We know that, said Adelbush. If it were not for that point, we would have considered the case against Mrs. 𝗏𝗲 conclusive. We would never have required an investigation. Perhaps, said Baley. Let's analyze the matter of means, then. There are two possibilities. Either Mrs. 𝗏𝗲 committed the murder, or someone else did. If Mrs. 𝗏𝗲 committed the murder, the weapon would have had to remain on the scene of the crime, unless it were removed later. It has been suggested by my partner, Mr. Oliver of Aurora, who is not present at the moment, that Dr. Thule had the opportunity to remove the weapon. I ask Dr. Thule now, in the presence of all of us, if he did this, if he removed a weapon while examining the unconscious Mrs. 𝗏𝗲. Dr. Thule was shaking. No, I swear it. I'll abide any questioning. I swear I removed nothing. Baley said, Is there anyone who wishes to suggest at this point that Dr. Thule is lying? There was a silence, during which Liebig looked at an object outside of Baley's view of vision and muttered something about the time. Baley said, The second possibility is that someone else committed the crime and carried the weapon off with him. But if that were so, one must ask why. Carrying the weapon away is an advertisement of the fact that Mrs. 𝗏𝗲 was not the murderess. If an outsider were the murderer, he would have to be a complete imbecile not to have the weapon with the corpse to convict Mrs. 𝗏𝗲. Either way, then, the weapon must be there, yet it was not seen. 𝗏𝗏𝗃 said, "Do you take us for fools or for blind men?" "I take you for Solarians," said Baley calmly, and therefore incapable of recognizing the particular weapon that was left at the scene of the crime as a weapon. "I don't understand a word," muttered Clarissa in distress. Even Gladia, who had scarcely moved a muscle during the course of the meeting, was staring at Baley in surprise. Baley said, "Dead husband and unconscious wife were not the only individuals on this scene. There was also a disorganized robot." "Well," said Liebig angrily, "isn't it obvious, then, that in having eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, is the truth? The robot at the scene of the crime was a murder weapon none of you could recognize by force of your training." They all talked at once, all but Gladia, who simply stared. Gladia raised his arms, or Baley raised his arms. "Hold it! Quiet! Let me explain." And once again he told the story of an attempt on Gruer's life and the method by which it could have been done, and the method in which it could have been accomplished. This time he added the attempt on his own life at the baby farm. Liebig said impatiently, "I suppose that was managed by having one robot poison an arrow without knowing it was using poison, and having a second robot hand the poisoned arrow to the boy after telling him that you were an earthman without its knowing that the arrow was poisoned. Something like that. Both robots would be completely instructed." "Very far-fetched," said Liebig. 𝗏𝗵𝗲 was pale and looked as though he might sick at any moment. No Solarian could possibly use robots to harm a human. "Maybe so," said Baley with a shrug, "but the point is the robot can be so manipulated. Ask Dr. Liebig. He is the roboticist." Liebig said, "It does not apply to the murder of Dr. 𝗏𝗲. I told you that yesterday. How can anyone arrange to have a robot smash a man's skull?" "Shall I explain how?" "Do so if you can," Baley said. It was a new model robot that Dr. 𝗏𝗲 was testing. The significance of that wasn't plain to me until last evening, when I had occasion to say to a robot in asking for his help in rising out of a chair, "Give me your hand." The robot looked at his own hand in confusion, and though he thought he was expected to detach and give it to me, I had to repeat my order less idiomatically, but it reminded me of something Dr. Liebig had told me earlier that day. There was experimentation among robots with replaceable limb. Suppose this robot that Dr. 𝗏𝗲 had been testing was one such, capable of using any number of different interchangeable limbs of various shapes and different kinds of specialized tasks. Suppose the murderer knew this and suddenly said to the robot, "Give me your arm." The robot would detach his arm and give it to him. The detached arm would make a splendid weapon. With Dr. 𝗏𝗲 dead, it could be snapped back into place. Shunned horror gave way to a babble of objection as Baley talked. His last sentence had to be shouted, and even so was all but drowned out. 𝗏𝗏𝗃, face flushed, raised himself from his chair and stepped forward. "Even if what you say is so, then Mrs. 𝗏𝗲 is the murderess. She was there. She quarreled with him. She would be watching her husband working with a robot and would know of the replaceable limb situation, which I don't believe, by the way. No matter what you do, Earthman, everything points to her." Gladia began to weep softly. Baley did not look at her. He said, "On the contrary, it is easy to show that whoever committed the murder, 𝗏𝗲 did not." Jotham 𝗧𝗵𝗲 suddenly folded his arms, and allowed an expression of contempt to settle on his face. Baley caught that and said, "You'll help me do so, Dr. 𝗧𝗵𝗲. As a roboticist, you know that maneuvering robots into action such as indirect murder takes enormous skill. I had occasion yesterday to try to put an individual under house arrest. I gave 3 robots detailed instructions intended to keep this individual safe. It was a simple thing, but I am a clumsy man with robots. There were loopholes in my instructions, and my prisoner escaped." "Who was the prisoner?" demanded 𝗧𝗵𝗲. "Beside the point," said Baley impatiently. "What is the point is the fact that amateurs can't handle robots well. For some Solarians may be pretty amateurish as Solarians go. For instance, what does Claudia Delmar know about robotics?" "Well, Dr. 𝗧𝗵𝗲." "What?" The roboticist stared. "You tried to teach Mrs. Delmar robotics. What kind of pupil was she? Did she learn anything?" 𝗧𝗵𝗲 looked about uneasily. "She didn't," and stalled. "She was completely hopeless, wasn't she? Or would you prefer not to answer?" 𝗧𝗵𝗲 said stiffly. "She might have pretended ignorance. As you prepared to say, as a roboticist, that you think Mrs. Delmar is sufficiently skilled to drive robots to indirect murder." "How can I answer that?" "Let me put it another way. Whoever tried to have me killed at the baby farm must have had to locate me by using inter-robot communication. After all, I told no human where I was going, and only the robots who conveyed me from point to point knew of my whereabouts. My partner, Daniil Oliva, managed to track me later in the day, but only with considerable difficulty. The murderer, on the other hand, must have done it easily, since, in addition to locating me, he had to arrange for arrow poisoning and arrow shooting, all before I left the farm and moved on. Would Mrs. Delmar have the skill to do that?" Corwin 𝗧𝗵𝗲 leaned forward. Who do you suggest would have the necessary skill, earthman?" Baley said, "Dr. Jotham 𝗧𝗵𝗲 is self-admittedly the best robot man on the planet." "Is that accusation?" cried 𝗧𝗵𝗲. "Yes," shouted Baley. "Oh." Thank you for obliging me a break. A little seamlessness, a little transition between paragraphs. The fury in 𝗧𝗵𝗲's eyes faded slowly. It was replaced not by calm exactly, but a kind of clamped down tension. He said, "I studied the Delmar robot after the murder. It had no detachable limbs. At least, they were detachable only in the usual sense of requiring special tools and expert handling. So the robot wasn't the weapon used in killing Delmar, and you have no argument." Baley said, "Who else can vouch for the truth of your statement?" "My word is not to be questioned. It is here. I'm accusing you, and your unsupported word concerning the robot is valueless. If someone else will bear you out, that would be different. Incidentally, you disposed of that robot quickly. Why? There was no reason to keep it. It was completely disorganized. It was useless. Why?" 𝗧𝗵𝗲 shook his finger at Baley and said violently, "You asked me that once before, Earthman, and I told you why. It had witnessed a murder which it had been powerless to stop. And you told me that always brought about complete collapse, that was a universal rule. Yet when Gruer was poisoned, the robot who had presented him with the poisoned drink was harmed only to the extent of a limp and a lisp. It had actually itself been the agent of what looked like murder at the moment, and not merely a witness, and yet it retained enough sanity to be questioned. This robot, the robot in the Delmar case, must therefore have been still more intimately concerned with murder than the Gruer robot. The Delmar robot must have had his own arm used as the murder weapon." "All nonsense," gasped out 𝗧𝗵𝗲. "You know nothing about robotics." Baley said, That's That's as may be. But I will suggest that security had Adalbish impounded the records of your robot factory and maintenance shop. Perhaps we can find out whether you have built robots with detachable limbs, and if so, whether any were sent to Del Mar, and if so, when. No one will tamper with my records, cried Liebig. Why? If you have nothing to hide, why? But why on Solaria should I want to kill Del Mar? Tell me that. What's my motive? I can think of two, said Baley. You were friendly with Mrs. Del Mar. Overly friendly. Solarians are human, after a fashion. You never consorted with women, but that doesn't keep you immune from, shall we say, animal urges. You saw Mrs. Del Mar. I beg your pardon. You viewed her when she was dressed rather informally, and... No! Cried Liebig in agony. And Gladia whispered energetically, No. Perhaps you don't recognize the nature of your feelings yourself, said Baley. Or if you had the dim notion of it, you despised yourself for your weaknesses and hated Mrs. Del Mar for inspiring it. And yet you might have hated Del Mar, too, for having her. You did ask Mrs. Del Mar to be your assistant. You compromised with your libido that far. She refused, and your hatred was the keener for that. By killing Dr. Del Mar in such a way as to throw suspicion on Mrs. Del Mar, you could be avenged on both at once. Who would believe that cheap, melodramatic filth? Demanded Liebig in a hoarse whisper. That's an ambulance. Another Earthman, another animal, maybe. No Solarian. I don't depend on that motive, said Baley. I think it was there, unconsciously, but you had a plainer motive, too. Dr. Ricane Del Mar was in the way of your plans, and had to be removed. What plans? Demanded Liebig. Your plans aiming at the conquest of the galaxy, Dr. Liebig, said Baley. Chapter the 18th. A question is answered. The Earthman is mad, cried Liebig, turning to the others. Isn't that obvious? Some stared at Liebig wordlessly, some at Baley. Baley gave them no chance to come to decisions. He said, You know better, Dr. Liebig. Dr. Del Mar was going to break off with you. Mrs. Del Mar thought it was because you wouldn't marry. I don't think so. Dr. Del Mar himself was planning a future in which ectogenesis would be possible and marriage unnecessary. But Dr. Del Mar was working with you. He would know and guess more about your work than anyone else. He would know if you were attempting dangerous experiments, and he would try to stop you. He hinted about such matters to Agent Gruer, but gave no details, because he was not yet certain of the details. Obviously, you discovered his suspicions and killed him. Mad, said Liebig again. I'll have nothing more to do with this. But Adalbish interrupted. Hear him out, Liebig. Baley bit his lip to keep from premature display of satisfaction at the obvious lack of sympathy in the security's head voice. He said, In the same discussion with me, in which you mentioned robots and detachable limbs, Dr. Liebig, you mentioned spaceships with built-in positronic brains. You were definitely talking too much then. Was it you that thought I was only an Earthman and incapable of understanding the implications of robots? Or was it that you had just been threatened with personal presence, had even had the threat lifted, and were a little delirious with relief? In either case, Dr. 𝗵𝗲 had already told me that the secret weapon of Solaria against the outer worlds was the positronic robot. 𝗵𝗲, thus unexpectedly referred to, started violently and cried, I meant it sociologically. I know, but it gives rise to thoughts. Consider the spaceship with a built-in positronic brain as compared to a manned spaceship. A manned spaceship could not use robots in active warfare. A robot could not destroy humans on enemy spaceships or on enemy worlds. It could not grasp the distinction between friendly humans and enemy humans. Of course, a robot could be told that the opposing spaceship had no humans aboard. It could be told that it was an uninhabited planet that was being bombarded. It would be difficult to manage. A robot could see that its own ship carried humans. It would know its own world held humans. It would assume that the same was true of enemy ships and worlds. It would take a real expert in robotics, such as you, Dr. Liebig, to handle them properly in that case. And there are very few such experts. But a spaceship that was engaged with its own positronic brain would cheerfully attack enemy ships it was directed to attack, it seems to me. It would naturally assume all other ships were unmanned. A positronic brain ship could easily be made incapable of receiving messages from enemy ships that might undeceive it. With its weapons and defenses under the immediate control of a positronic brain, it would be more maneuverable than any manned ship, with no room necessary for crewmen, for supplies, for water or air purifiers. It could carry more armor, more weapon, and be more invulnerable than any ordinary ship. One ship with a positronic brain could defeat fleets of ordinary ships. Am I wrong? The last question was shot at Dr. Liebig, who had risen from his seat and was standing, rigid, almost cataleptic, with what? Anger? Horror? There was no answer. No answer could have been heard. Something tore loose, and the others were yelling madly. Clarissa had the face of fury, and even Gladia was on her feet, her small fist beating the air threateningly. They all had turned on Liebig. Baley relaxed and closed his eyes. He tried for just a few moments to unknot his muscles, unfreeze his tendons. It had worked. He had pressed the right buttons at last. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 had made an analogy between a Solarian robot and the Spartan Helix. He said the robots could not revolt so that the Solarians could relax. But what if some human threatened to teach the robots how to harm humans, to make them, in other words, capable of revolting? Would that not be the ultimate crime? On a world such as Solaria, would not every last inhabitant turn fiercely against anyone even suspected of making a robot capable of harming a human? On Solaria, where robots outnumber humans by 20,000 to 1? Edelbish cried. You are under arrest. You are absolutely forbidden to touch your books or records until the government has a chance to inspect them. He went on almost incoherently, scarcely heard in the pandemonium. A robot approached Baley. A message, Master, from the Master 𝗧𝗵𝗲. Baley took the message gravely, turned, and cried, "One moment!" His voice had an almost magical effect. All turned to look at him solemnly, and in no face, outside Liebig's frozen glare, was there any sign of anything but the most painful attention to the earthman. Baley said, "It is foolish to expect Dr. Liebig to leave his records untouched while waiting for some official to reach them. So even before this interview began, my partner, Daniil 𝗧𝗵𝗲, left for Dr. Liebig's estate. I have just heard from him. He is on the grounds now, and will be with Dr. Liebig in a moment in order that he may be put under restraint." "Restraint!" howled Liebig in an almost animal terror. His eyes widened into staring holes in his head. "Someone coming here? Personal presence? No! No!" The second no was a shriek. "You will not be harmed," said Baley coldly, "if you cooperate." "But I won't see him. I can't see him." The roboticist fell on his knees without seeming aware of the motion. He put his hands together in a desperate, clasped gesture of appeal. "What do you want? Do you want a confession? Delmare's robots had detachable limbs. Yes. I arranged Gruer's poisoning. I arranged the arrow meant for you. I even planned the spaceships, as you said. I haven't succeeded, but yes, I planned it. Only keep the man away. Don't let him come. Keep him away." He was babbling. Baley nodded. Another right button. The threat of personal presence would do more to induce confession than any physical torture, but then, at some noise or movement aside the field of sound or vision of any of the others, Liebig's head twisted and his mouth opened. He lifted a pair of hands, holding something off. "Away," he begged. "Go away. Don't come. Please don't come. Please." He scrambled away on hands and knees. Then his hands were suddenly in a pocket in his jacket and came out with something that moved rapidly to his mouth. Swaying twice, he fell prone. Baley wanted to cry. "You fool, it isn't a human that's approaching. Only one of the robots you love." Genetically 𝗧𝗵𝗲 darted into the field of vision and for a moment stared down at the crumpled figure. Baley held his breath. If Daniil should realize it was his own pseudo-humanity that had killed Liebig, the effect of the first law-enslaved brain might be drastic. But Daniil only knelt, and his delicate fingers touched Liebig here and there. Then he lifted Liebig's head, as though it were infinitely precious to him, cradling it, caressing it. His beautifully chiseled face stared down at the others, as he whispered, "A human is dead." Baley was expecting her. She had asked for a last interview, but his eyes widened when she appeared. He said, "I'm seeing you." "Yes," said 𝗧𝗏𝗲. "How can you tell?" "You're wearing gloves." "Oh." She looked at her hands in confusion, then softly, "Do you mind?" "No, of course not. But why have you decided to see me rather than view?" "Well," she smiled weakly, I've got to get used to it, don't I, Elijah? I mean, if I'm going to Aurora, then it's all arranged. Mr. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 seems to have influence. It's all arranged. I'll never come back." "Good. You'll be happier, 𝗧𝗏𝗲. I know you will." "I'm a little afraid." "I know. It will mean seeing all the time, and you won't have the comforts you had on Solaria. But you'll get used to it in the end, and once more, you'll forget all the terror you've been through." "I don't want to forget everything," said 𝗧𝗏𝗲 softly. "You will." Baley looked at the slim girl who stood before him and said, not without a momentary pang, "And you will be married someday, too. Really married, I mean." "Somehow," she said mournfully, "that doesn't seem so attractive to me right now." "You'll change your mind." And they stood there, looking at each other for a wordless moment. 𝗧𝗏𝗲 said, "I've never thanked you." Baley said, "It was only my job." "You'll be going back to Earth now, won't you?" "Yes." "I'll never see you again." "Probably not. But don't feel badly about that. In 40 years at most, I'll be dead. And you won't look a bit different than the way you do now." Her face twisted. "Don't say that. It's true," she said rapidly, as though forced to change the subject. "It's all true about Trothan Liebig, you know." "I know. Other roboticists went over his record and found experiments towards unmanned intelligent spaceships. They also found other robots with replaceable limbs." 𝗧𝗏𝗲 shuddered. "Why did he do such a terrible thing, do you suppose?" "He was afraid of people. He killed himself to avoid personal presence, and he was ready to kill other worlds to make sure Solaria had, and its personal presence taboo would never be touched." "How could he feel so?" she murmured. "When personal presence can be so fairy." Again, a silent moment while they faced each other at 10 paces. Then 𝗧𝗏𝗲𝗲 cried. And 𝗧𝗏𝗲𝗲 cried suddenly, "Oh, Elijah, you'll think it abandoned." "Oh, Elijah, you will think it abandoned of me." "Think what abandoned?" "May I touch you? I'll never see you again, Elijah." "If you want to." Step by step, she came closer, her eyes glowing, yet look apprehensive too. She stopped 3 feet away, then slowly, as though in a trance, she began to remove the glove on her right hand. Baley started a restraining gesture. "Don't be foolish, 𝗧𝗏𝗲𝗲. "I'm not afraid," said 𝗧𝗏𝗲𝗲. Her hand was bare. It trembled as she extended it, and so did Baley's as she took her hand in his. They remained so for one moment, her hand a shy thing, frightened as it rested in his. He opened his hand, and hers escaped, darting suddenly suddenly and without warning towards his face until her fingertips rested feather-light upon his cheek for the barest moment. She said, "Thank you, Elijah. Goodbye." He said, "Goodbye, Gladia," and watched her leave. Even the thought that a ship was waiting to take him back to Earth did not wipe out the sense of loss he felt at that moment. Under-Secretary Albert Minnham's look was intended to be one of prim welcome. "I'm glad to see you back on Earth. I suppose, of course, your report, of course, arrived before you did and is being studied. You did a good job. The matter will look well in your record." "Thank you," said Baley. There was no room for further elation in him. Being back on Earth, being safe in the caves, being in hearing of Jessie's voice, he had spoken to her already, had left him strangely empty. "However," said Minnham, "your report concerned only the murder investigation. There was another matter we were interested in. May I have a report on that verbally?" Baley hesitated, and his hand moved automatically toward the inner pocket, where the warm comfort of his pipe could once more be found. Minnham said at once, "You may smoke, Baley." Baley made for the lighting process a rather drawn-out ritual. He said, "I am not a sociologist." "Aren't you?" Minnham smiled briefly. "It seemed to me we discussed that once. A successful detective must be a good rule-of-thumb sociologist, even if he never heard of Hackett's equation. I think, from your discomfort at the moment, that you have notions concerning the outer worlds but aren't sure how it will sound to me." "If you put it that way, sir, when you ordered me on Solaria, you asked a question. You asked what the weaknesses of the outer worlds were. Their strengths were their robots, their low population, their long lives, but what of their weaknesses?" "Well, I believe I know the weaknesses of the Solarians, sir." "You can answer my question? Good. Go ahead." "Their weaknesses, sir, are their robots, their low population, their long lives." Minnham stared at Baley without any change of expression. His hands worked in jerky, finger-drawn designs along his papers on his desk. He said, "Why do you say that?" Baley had spent hours organizing his thoughts on his way back from Solaria, had confronted officialdom in imagination with balanced, well-reasoned arguments. Now he felt at a loss. He said, "I'm not sure I can put them clearly. No matter, let me hear. This is the first approximation only." Baley said, "The Solarians have given up something humankind has had for millions of years, something worth more than atomic power, cities, agriculture, tools, fire, everything, because it's something that made everything else possible." "I don't want to guess, Baley. What is it?" "The tribe, sir. Cooperation between individuals. Solaria has given that up entirely. It is a world of isolated individuals, and the planet's only sociologist is delighted that this is so. That sociologist, by the way, never heard of sociomathematics because he is inventing his own science. There is no one to teach him, no one to help him, no one to think of something he himself might miss. The only science that really flourishes on Solaris is robotics, and there are only a handful of men involved in that, and when it came to analysis of an interaction of robots and men, they had to call in an earthman for help. Solarian art, sir, is abstract. We have abstract art on Earth as one form of art, but on Solaria it is the only form. The human touch is gone. The looked-for future is one of ectogenesis and complete isolation from birth." Minnham said, "It all sounds horrible, but is it harmful?" "I think so. Without the interplay of human against human, the chief interest in life is gone. Most of the intellectual values are gone. Most of the reasons for living is gone. Viewing is no substitute for seeing. The Solarians themselves are conscious that viewing is a long-distance sense. And if isolation isn't enough to induce stagnation, there's the matter of their long lives. On Earth, we have a continuous influx of young people who are willing to change because they haven't had time to grow hard set in their ways. I suppose there's some optimum. A life long enough for real accomplishment and short enough to make way for youth at a rate that's not too slow. On Solaria, the rate is too slow. Minim, still drawing patterns with his fingers. Interesting. Interesting. He looked up. It was as though a mask had fallen away. There was glee in his eyes. Plainclothesman, you're a man of penetration. Thank you, said Baley stiffly. Do you know why I encouraged you to describe your views to me? He was almost like a little boy, hugging his pleasure. He went on, without waiting for an answer. Your report has already undergone preliminary analysis by our sociologists, and I was wondering if you had any idea yourself as to the excellent news for Earth you had brought with you. I see you have. But wait, said Baley. There's more to this. There is indeed, said Minim jubilantly. Solaria cannot possibly correct its stagnation. It has passed a critical point, and their dependence on robots has gone too far. Individual robots can't discipline an individual child. Even though discipline may do the child eventual good, the robot can't see past the immediate pain, and robots collectively cannot discipline a planet by allowing its institutions to collapse when the institutions have grown harmful. They can't see past the immediate chaos, so the only end for the outer worlds is perpetual stagnation, and Earth will be freed of their domination. This new data changes everything. Physical revolt will not even be necessary. Freedom will come of itself. Wait, said Baley again more loudly. It's only Solaria we're discussing, not any other outer world. It is the same thing. Your Solarian sociologist, 𝗧𝗵𝗲, sir. 𝗧𝗵𝗲, then. He said, did he not, that the other outer worlds are moving in the direction of Solaria? He did, but he knew nothing about the other outer worlds firsthand. He was no sociologist, not really. I thought I made that clear. Our own men will check. They'll lack data, too. We know nothing about the really big outer worlds, Aurora, for instance, Daniel's world. To me, it doesn't seem reasonable to expect them to do anything like Solaria. In fact, there's only one world in the galaxy which resembles Solaria. Minim was dismissing the subject with a small, happy wave of his neat hand. Our men will check. I'm sure they will agree with 𝗧𝗵𝗲. Baley's stare grew somber. If Earth's sociologists were anxious enough for happy news, they would find themselves agreeing with 𝗧𝗵𝗲. At that, anything could be found in figures if the search were long enough and hard enough, and if the proper pieces of information were ignored or overlooked. He hesitated. Was it best now to speak while he had the ear of the man high in government, or... He hesitated a trifle too long. Minim was speaking again, shuffling a few papers and growing more matter-of-fact. A few minor matters, plainclothesman, concerning the 𝗏𝗲 case itself, and then you will be free to go. Do you intend to have Liebig commit suicide? I intended to force a confession, sir. I had not anticipated suicide at the approach, ironically, of someone who was only a robot and who would not really be violating the taboo against personal presence, but frankly, I don't regret his death. He was a dangerous man. It will be a long time before there will be another man who will combine his sickness and his brilliance. I agree with that, said Minim dryly, and consider his death fortunate. But didn't you consider your danger if the Solarians had stopped to realize that Liebig couldn't have murdered 𝗏𝗲? Baley took the pipe out of his mouth and said nothing. Come, plainclothesman, said Minim. You know he didn't. The murder required personal presence, and Liebig would die rather than allow that. He did die rather than allow it. Baley said, You're right, sir. I counted on the Solarians being too horrified at his misuse of robots to stop to think of that. Then who did kill 𝗏𝗲? Baley said slowly, If If you mean who struck the actual blow, it was the person everyone knew had done so, 𝗧𝗲𝗲 𝗡𝗵𝗲, the man's wife. And you let her go? Baley said, morally, the responsibility wasn't hers. Liebig knew 𝗧𝗲𝗲 quarreled bitterly with her husband, and often. He must have known how furious she could grow in moments of anger. Liebig wanted the death of the husband under circumstances that would incriminate the wife. So he supplied 𝗡𝗵𝗲 with a robot and, I imagine, instructed it with all the skill he possessed to hand 𝗧𝗲𝗲 one of its detachable limbs at the moment of her full fury. With a weapon in her hand at the crucial moment, she acted in a temporary blackout before either 𝗡𝗵𝗲 or the robot could stop her. 𝗧𝗲𝗲 was as much Liebig's unwitting instrument as the robot itself. 𝗵𝗲 said, the robot's arm must have been smeared with blood and matted hair. It probably was, said Baley, but it was Liebig who took the murdered robot in charge. He could easily have instructed any other robot who might have noticed the fact to forget it. Dr. 𝗧𝗏 might have noticed it, but he inspected only the dead man and the unconscious woman. Liebig's mistake was to think the guilt would rest so obviously on 𝗧𝗲𝗲 that the matter of the absence of an obvious weapon at the scene wouldn't save her. Nor could he anticipate that an earthman would be called in to help with the investigation. So, with Liebig dead, you arranged to have 𝗧𝗲𝗲 leave Solaria. Was that to save her in case any Solarians began thinking about the case? Baley shrugged. She had suffered enough. She had been victimized by everybody, by her husband, by Liebig, by the world of Solaria. 𝗵𝗲 said, weren't you bending the law to suit a personal whim? Baley's craggy face grew hard. It was not a whim. I was not bound by Solarian law. Earth's interests were paramount, and for the sake of those interests, I had to see that Liebig, the dangerous one, was dealt with. As for Mrs. 𝗏𝗲, he faced 𝗵𝗲 now, and felt himself taking a crucial step. He had to say this. As for Mrs. 𝗏𝗲, I made her the basis of an experiment. What experiment? I wanted to know if she would consent to face a world where personal presence was permitted and expected. I was curious to know if she had the courage to face disreputation of habits so deeply settled in her. I was afraid she might refuse to go, that she might insist on remaining on Solaria, which was purgatory for her, rather than bring herself to abandon her distorted, Solarian way of life. But she chose change, and I am glad she did, because to me it seemed symbolic. It seemed to open the gates of salvation for us. For us, said 𝗵𝗲 with energy. What the devil do you mean? Not for you and me particularly, sir, said Baley gravely, but for all mankind. You're wrong about the outer worlds. They have few robots. They permit personal presence, and they have been investigating Solaria. Our Daniel Oliver was there with me, you know, and he'll bring back a report. There is a danger they may become Solarius someday, but they will probably recognize that danger, and work to keep themselves in a reasonable balance, and in a way they remain the leaders of mankind. That is your opinion, said 𝗵𝗲 testily, and there's more to it. There is one world like Solaria, and that's Earth. Plainclothesman Baley. It's so, sir. We are Solaria inside out. They retreated into isolation from one another. We retreated into isolation from the galaxy. They are at the dead end of their inviolatable estates. We are at the dead end of underground cities. They're leaders without fellows, only leaders without followers, only robots who can't talk back. We're followers without leaders, only enclosing cities to keep us safe. Baley's fist clenched. 𝗵𝗲 disapproved. Plainclothesman, you have been through an ordeal. You need to rest, and you will have one. A month's vacation, full pay, and a promotion at the end of it. Thank you, but that's not all I want. I want you to listen. There's only one direction out of our dead end, and that's outward, toward space. There are 1,000,000 worlds out there, and the spacers only own 50. They are few and long-lived. We are many and short-lived. We are better suited than any for exploration and colonization. We have population pressures to push us and rapid turnover of generation to keep us supplied with young and reckless. It was our ancestors who colonized the outer worlds in the first place. Yes, I see, but I'm afraid our time is up. Baley could feel the other's anxiety to be rid of him, and he remained stolidly in place. He said, "When the original colonization established a world superior to our own in technology, we escaped by building wombs beneath the ground for ourselves. The spacers made us feel inferior, and we hid from them. That's no answer. To avoid the destructive rhythm of rebellion and suppression, we must compete with them, follow them if we must, lead them if we can. To do that, we must face the open. We must teach ourselves to face the open. If it is too late to teach ourselves, we must teach our children. It's vital." "You need rest, plainclothesman," Baley said violently. "Listen to me, sir. If the spacers are strong and we remain as we are, then Earth will be destroyed within a century. That has been computed, as you yourself told me. If the spacers are really weak and are growing weaker, then we may escape. But who says the spacers are weak? The Solarians, yes, but that's all we know. But I'm not through. One thing we can change, whether the spacers are weak or strong, we can change the way we are. Let us face the open and we'll never need rebellion. We can spread out into our own crowd of worlds and become spacers ourselves. If we stay here on Earth, cooped up, then useless and fatal rebellion can't be stopped. It will be all the worse if the people build any false hopes because of spacers' weaknesses. Go ahead, ask the sociologist. Put my argument to them, and if they're still in doubt, find a way to send me to Aurora. Let me bring back a report on the real spacers, and you'll see what Earth must do." Minim nodded. Yes. "Good day, now plainclothesman Baley." Baley left with a feeling of exaltation. He had not expected an open victory over Minim. Victories over ingrained patterns of thought were not won in a day or a year. But he had seen a look of pensive uncertainty that crossed Minim's face and had blotted out, at least for a while, the earlier, uncritical joy. He felt he could see into the future. Minim would ask the sociologists, and one or two of them would be uncertain. They would wander. They would consult Baley. Give it 1 year, thought Baley. 1 year, and I'll be on my way to Aurora. 1 generation, and we'll be out in space once more. Baley stepped onto the northbound expressway. Soon he would see Jessie. Would she understand that his son, Bentley, now 17, when Ben had a 17-year-old of his own, would he be standing on some empty world, building a spacious life? It was a frightening thought. Baley still feared the open, but he no longer feared the fear. It was not something to run from, that fear, but something to fight. Baley felt as though a touch of madness had come over him. For the first time, the open had had its weird attraction over him, from the time in the ground car when he had tricked Daniil in order to have the top lowered so he might stand up in the open air. He had failed to understand then. Daniil thought he was being perverse. Baley himself thought he was facing the open out of a professional necessity to solve a crime. Only on that last evening on Solaria, when the curtain tearing away from the window, did he realize his need to face the open for open's own sake, for its attraction and its promise of freedom. There must be millions on Earth who would feel that same urge. If the open were only brought to their attention, if they could be made to take the first step. He looked about. The expressway was speeding on. All about him was artificial light and huge banks of apartments, gliding backward and flashing signs in store windows, and factories and lights and noises and crowds and more noise and people and people and people. It was all he had loved, all he had hated and feared to leave, all he had thought he longed for on Solaria. And it was all strange to him. He couldn't make himself fit back in. He had gone out to solve a murder, and something had happened to him. He had told 𝗵𝗲 the cities were wombs, and so they were. And what was the first thing a man must do before he can be a man? He must be born. He must leave the womb, and once left, he could not be re-entered. Baley had left the city and could not re-enter. The city was no longer his. The caves of steel were alien. This had to be. And it would be so for others. And Earth would be born again and reach outward. His heart beat madly, and the noise of life about him sank into an unheard murmur. He remembered his dream on Solaria, and he understood it at last. He lifted his head, and he could see through all the steel and concrete and humanity above him. He could see the beacon, yet set in space to lure men outward. He could see it shining down. The Naked Sun by Isaac Asimov. Thank you for allowing me to express that book to you. It's a book that I loved a long time ago. Now, yes, beautiful book, good Isaac Asimov, great positronic brain, yes. There's one thing I think that the underground might be capable of saying, and to say that would be an honor, and I shall not press it any further. But if the end of the Naked Sun seemed to become something of an anthem or a rally to open up the economies, then I'll admit that I had a difficult time suppressing that realization in myself. If it seemed to be possessing of an innate claim of truth coming from me, an idea that to deny the ability to open up and resort to stagnation was in effect suicide, then I think that needs be admitted and brought into the air. If we can look at the possibility of growing up ourselves so as to not be afraid of open spaces, so as not to be afraid of danger. Let me rephrase that. To not be afraid of fear. As a pandemic eloquently illustrates, danger is a certainty. The chance that any of us survive life is something like 0%. While we have life, I think we have the ability to handle it honorably. I fucking hate that word. Handle it in a way that our ancestors wouldn't scorn us. Handle it in a way that proves our right to our intellect. Handle it in a way that may grant our future generations the possibility to explore the universe and not bunker down in underground cities and wait for the inevitable revolt, suppression, revolt, suppression.